Hello and welcome back to another episode of The World Beyond Belief. This is episode 138. I am your co-host, Mindy Erkin, and with me today, as always, is your host, Paul Marco.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of World Beyond Belief. It's great to have you with us. Today we're going to talk about the links between the secret services. And by the secret services, I mean, well, the Army has a secret service, the Navy has secret service, and then there's always the secret service kind of organizations, the NSA, CIA, FBI, Mossad, MI6, MI5, and their links in with the Satanists and the pedophiles that we've been talking about for the last several weeks, especially delving into the Hampstead case. We're going to take a break from the Hampstead case. I'm still watching it, but we're going to take a break and look at kind of a larger context. Because if we're thinking that it's a group of, I said last week, maybe 34 million, according to Jay Parker, who's an ex-Satanist. He was born into a family of Satanists. He says that it's that large, and then of course we have to contend with their minions, their parapsychopathological people who serve them, and then of course there's the rest of us who are paid off to go along with this charade, because mostly we're not aware of how deep it goes and how damaging it is, and the fact that it's just simply wrong, and they've got to stop it. You can't have a species of humans on the planet and the planet survive if this is going to continue, because it's going to continue and grow because nobody can stop it. Don't you see? It's like a dead end. When this bites into human society, we can't allow it to continue. We have to stop. So we're going to study it this week, especially in terms of people that we pay that are Satanists. While we go through this discussion, or I probably will go through the discussion mostly, I've been talking a lot the last couple of weeks, I want you to keep one question in mind and see if you can come up with an answer. Here's the question. If evil is on our side, who then is our enemy? If evil is on our side, who is our enemy? Or if you want to think of it this way, if your government employs Satanists and pedophiles that do ritual sacrifices as part of their job, who is their enemy? That's an important one. Or think of it this way. If Satanists control governments on your behalf, what force is against us? So if evil is working on behalf of us, who are we working against? Just want you to think about that as we go through the information that we're going to talk about today. For the last couple of weeks, we've been considering Judge Palfrey's judgment in the Hampstead child molestation Satanism case. And we can learn from her behavior that there are people, a lot of people, it goes way down into the system, that cover up for these Satanists, that cover up for these beasts. And obviously nobody's speaking out anywhere. Nobody's speaking out. None of the MPs are speaking out. There are a few rogue policemen who are coming forward and saying things, but mum's the word. So that gives you an idea of how controlled they are and how in control they are. I think that we can say that governments around the world, especially English-speaking nations, and I say that mostly because I'm familiar with them. This could be the same all over the world. governments seem to cover up for satanic behavior. As we've seen in the last couple of podcasts, if you go back and you look at our podcast 133, 135, and 137, you'll see that we covered pretty clearly and concisely a major abomination that's taken place in Hampstead. And we can learn a lot from that case because it's a pattern that actually we're going to see later on in this hour. So we can say that governments do cover up satanic behavior, and also they employ people. This is one thing that we'll talk about today. They employ people to do satanic endeavors on whose behalf, I have no idea. But there are people employed in the governments, especially all the secret service agencies, that participate in satanic behavior. Ritual sacrifices, child molestation, blackmail through child molestation, and so forth. They're on the payroll. And also, governments spend and do a lot to discredit, frame, murder, and hide the perpetrators of satanic behavior. You see, it's real important. We're talking about a spiritual battle here, don't you know? We're talking about the battle between good and evil. We're talking about the battle between light and dark, and I hate to be so black and white about it, but it's actually what's happening. And the best thing to do to eliminate the evil behavior is to shed light on it. So that's why we've kind of devoted our last couple podcasts to exposing the activities of the dark side so that we can see what they do, who they work for, what they do. You know, what they do on the weekends, I don't know. But anyway, we're going to look at the Satanists today in the podcast. Now, I think the points 1 and 3 I just made are pretty clear to everybody if they've been following this case or following actually the UK press for the last 20 years. They know that satanic behavior is covered up. And they also know, my point number 3, they'll discredit, frame, and even murder people to keep this thing covered up. But what many people don't know is that we employ people to do satanic behaviors. We employ Satanists and people who take orders from Satanists. I want to bring to light in this podcast, we'll start with this guy and then I want to end with this guy because he's such a disgusting character. Actually, quite frankly, I can't even watch him. He looks like he's got eyebrows that he's got them shaved up so they look like Mr. Spock. He's kind of a pudgy little guy. I don't know, there's something about his vibe. He actually makes me sick. You know, and I'm not like that with even some other people that are into Satanism. I know that Anton LaVey, I don't like the man. I think he's really dark, but I'm not physically repulsed by anybody like I am this Michael Aquino. So keep that in mind as I go through this. Keep in mind the fact that I'm absolutely not objective about this. I think this is a horrible thing. Let's get introduced to Michael Aquino by him talking to our old friend Ted Gunderson, who's done his best while he was alive to uncover this Satanistic roots, and our Satanist, who later turned out to be an Army general, Thomas Aquino.
Isn't it Michael Aquino?
Michael Aquino, yeah, really good. Let's go back to probably the early 80s, late 70s, maybe the mid-80s, with Geraldo Rivera on a TV show.
Respected law enforcement professional, recently or retired now from the FBI, former regional director of Los Angeles. Do you, sir, believe that these dreadful allegations of babies being sacrificed are true?
I absolutely believe it, without any doubt. Based on the information that's been given to me, across the country by numerous survivors and by confidential sources and informants.
Then why don't you name these people and arrest them? Never a name, never an arrest. These women come out of a group and they insist that they know the people in the group, and yet they do not identify these large mysterious cults. Name them and arrest them and get them off the street.
Does he not make a valid point?
He makes a valid point. The problem with that is, number one, police officers don't believe it. I may believe it. You may believe it. Some people in your audience may believe it. They don't believe it. Number two, if you decide to investigate these people, you have to, number one, handle it from an undercover operation. If you put an undercover operation into effect, then you have, in a sense, your own police officers become involved in these heinous crimes, and they are, of course, become murderers. And in addition to that, if you do decide to investigate these people, it's a lot of work. And many law enforcement officers are apathetic and don't want to get involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard this. The debate here could rage over this issue alone for hours and hours and hours. Michael Aquino is right when he says there have not been any successful prosecutions for this horrible allegation. Ted Gunderson is a sincere man with a good reputation who says that there are difficulties in the prosecution. Still, the point is it has never been proven in a court of law. Obviously, it needs more investigation, but if these things are happening, then there should be a national task force of federal and state and local cops working together to prove or disprove. Because this is just unacceptable, this impasse. Coming up, we're going to have warning signs you should watch for, parents, and all of our guests will be available for a final discussion about Satanism after this break.
Well, yeah, I think he's really revolting, and being on the same stage with Ted Gunderson, who is, I think, a saint, really makes a black and white contrast. Easy to see the difference for me, maybe not you. So in this clip, he used a common satanic behavior, defense, which makes no sense at all. First of all, there have been satanic cults, although not brought to trial. There have been satanic cults that have been killed by FBI raids, like in Waco. Charles Manson, I believe they connected him with satanic cults. If they didn't, they should have. So that's not absolutely true. And if you've been following us on the Hampstead case, you know that it's really difficult to get people to even investigate satanic ritual abuses. Geraldo ends by saying, the debate could go on forever and ever. Well, listen, I'm going to tell you something. This is not a debate. It's not like debating whether we should have apple pie or cherry crisp for dinner. It's not a debate. There's morality in this universe. And there's wrong things that you can do, and then there's good things that you can do. You can do things in harmony with natural law, where you're not invading someone's right or their privacy or taking their property. And then there's people who violate all those. They take the most precious property. They take the lives, especially the lives of the young, innocent children. This is wrong. And you can take all the New Age ideas of moral relativity and, it's a perception and it's in your mind. No, it's not in my mind. It's out there in the world and they're doing wrong. They're Satanists, and that's what they do. It's like, I'm going to hire a child murderer as my nanny for my child. And then I'm surprised when the nanny murders my child. Well, I was a murderer before I took him in. I mean, it was. I knew he was a snake before I took him in. You remember that song?
No, I don't.
No, she doesn't remember it. I get it. It's a long time ago. Anyway, it's not a debate. There's a morality here, and there's right and wrong, and that's wrong. Also, want you to know, and you'll know as we unfold the stories in this podcast that a lot of this satanic behavior is paid for by your tax dollars, generally to benefit the people that are in power, both physically, by partaking and also ritualistic drinking of blood, but also getting favors by, if there is a satanic entity, they certainly go to a large extent to display their allegiance to it and worship it whenever they can and do heinous things to support it. Now, one of the things that Aquino is involved in, Michael Aquino, is the mind control programs in the Army. Actually, he was, let me see, I'm looking here. He was the former head of all U.S. military psychological warfare operations before being promoted to the PSYOP chief. So Aquino is in charge of mind control. Now, mind control, if it was hypnotism, or if it was only hypnotism, or if it was only drugs, that'd be one thing. But the type of mind control that the U.S. government and the U.K. government use is trauma-based mind control. And you know what trauma is? That's when you're in extreme fear, when you're in extreme pain, when you're in so much fear or pain that your personality splits and you become a schizophrenic, basically, so you can deal with the horrors you're going through. That's how they craft this mind control cocktail that the Satanist, I don't know, what does a general make? I don't know, hundreds of thousands, I'm certain. And then, of course, they get contracts after they leave, probably contracts while they're in there. So we pay them very well to do these types of things. Let's take a look at an old mind control movie give you a little hint about what we're talking about when we're talking about mind control.
Dr. Ewan Cameron was president of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. He ran the Allen Memorial Institute, which was founded in 1943 with funds from the Rockefeller Foundation. Nazi paperclip scientists made their way into the CIA and military-sponsored mind control programs here in the United States and Canada. Some of these scientists were friends of Dr. Cameron. Money for Dr. Cameron's operation came from the CIA and was funneled through the Cornell Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. The systematic annihilation or depatterning of a subject's mind and memory was accomplished with overdoses of LSD, barbiturate sleep for 65 days at a stretch, and electroshock therapy at 75 times the recommended dosage. Psychic driving, the repetition of a recorded message for 24 hours a day, programmed the empty mind. The Canadian government settled a class action lawsuit by 250 former patients of Dr. Cameron decades later, but no person or institution has ever been disciplined or punished for these activities. Linda MacDonald was 25 years old in 1963 when Dr. Cameron treated her for mild postpartum depression. She received 102 electroshock therapy treatments, 80 days of drug-induced sleep, and emerged completely depatterned, essentially like a newborn, totally incontinent, unable to state her name or recognize her husband and children. She had to relearn how to drive, cook, read, and use a toilet. Eventually, unlike many of Dr. Cameron's patients, she made a fairly complete recovery. Dr. Cameron was the premier psychiatrist of the 20th century. He had studied Nazi scientists at the Nuremberg trials and later replicated many of their methods and sought their assistance in the race to control the human mind. Dr. Cameron's mind control experiments were one program out of many programs run by the CIA, Navy, Air Force, Army, and others. Although many parallel programs were occurring in the United States, none of them were ever discovered or prosecuted. These programs were run by Dr. Morse Allen, Dr. L. Wilson Green, Dr. Martin T. Orne, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, Dr. James Hamilton, and others. These American and foreign-born programmers were supervised by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was in turn supervised by Richard Helms and the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles.
I was tired, I was depressed, my back was hurting. And so he said to the children's father, why don't you go to Montreal and visit this Dr. Ewan Cameron, this famous man who has all of these accolades, and have an assessment. So we went. My medical file even says that I took my guitar with me. And that was the end of my life. Within 3 weeks, Dr. Cameron decided to call me an acute schizophrenic and ship me up to the sleep room. I was in a coma for 86 days.
86 days of unbroken sleep.
Yeah. Total comatose state. I had to be toilet trained. I was a vegetable. I had no identity. I had no memory. I'd never existed in the world before. Like a baby. Just like a baby that has to be toilet trained. Pictures, and I know who that is, who they are, but I don't remember them as my children at all. I mean, I know that they came from my body, but there's no, that's all. I don't know, and that's because I was told that. So these are my children. I'm stubborn, too. It got to the point where every time, whether it was John Crosby or Raina Titian or then the Honorable Kim Campbell, it got to be, you guys, we're gonna stay alive. And I said that to Brian Mulrooney, too. If you think I'm going away, you've got another thing coming. I'm not going to go away. I finally discovered...
Linda MacDonald would hound the federal government for 4 years before finally in 1992, Ottawa grudgingly agreed to compensate her and some of Dr. Cameron's other victims $100,000 each in exchange for signing away the right to sue the government or the hospital. But it was an ambiguous victory. Ottawa refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing at the Allen, a conclusion backed up by a legal review of what happened there.
It was an awful feeling to realize when I found this out that the man whom I had thought cared about what happened to me didn't give a damn. I was a fly. Just a fly.
Well, the reason I wanted that to play through is so that you could see how highly sponsored these outrageous programs are. Now let me be real practical, and let me hone into a problem that some people may have with this. You know, they say control of the human mind. Yes, governments must have control of the human mind. Is that a good idea? I mean, I think that it really works the other way. If you have to have governments, I think they work to, kind of facilitate whatever people want to do. It's not a matter of, although government, actually, gover means control and ment means mental. The actual word means mind control. I think that it's not a good use of a government. I mean, if I were to create a government, but I wouldn't create a government because I think they're all mind control. So this is your government using your tax dollars to get a better handle on how they can control you, how they can manipulate you, how they can get you to eat what they want, how they can get you to agree to a forced vaccination. They really want to be able to control that. So that's the motivation. That's why they'll tell you that they want to employ Satanists. Well, that's why they'll tell you that Michael Aquino was a key that guy is so repulsive to me. I can't even imagine shaking hands with him, being in the same room with him, let alone taking orders from him. Generals have an incredible span of control. There were, thousands at least of people who were in his line of command. I would think, unless he was in a staff position. I don't know. Depends on how it goes. But anyway, I wanted to introduce you a little bit to the fact that your government isn't opposed to Satanism and will employ Satanism if it's to their benefit. But if it's to the benefit of the Satanist, is it to the benefit of you, who's a human, who's a good-hearted human being? Anyway, let's take a little break from Michael Aquino, and let's look at a little bit broader look at what's going on lately. I've been amazed at the number of YouTube videos. This is a little off the topic, but I'll blend it back. Trust me. A number of YouTube videos made by people explaining to me what Jade Helm is. Now, you probably, if you're aware at all, you know that Jade Helm is an exercise that's planned to be conducted by the US government, the Army. I don't really know what branch of the service, but they're going to work in like 5 western states, and they're going to practice occupying those states. And of course, the Army's saying, well, don't worry, it's just, we're practicing here in western states because they're kind of deserty, and we're going to need to take it to Iran when we have to attack Iran. But if you look closely at it at all, I mean, they certainly have places to train overseas. And if they're training to infiltrate the native population, I think they need to speak something other than English. So the rationale that the government gives doesn't make any sense in this case. So it's upsetting all the, what can I say, conspiracy-oriented, I'm going to call them people whose mind are opening to what's going on around them. It's upsetting them because normally when they're pulling a false flag exercise like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or something, they have a drill. Pearl Harbor was probably a bad example, but Boston bombing is a good example where they were having a drill. So they do those things. So everybody's saying, well, I've got my gun, I've got my knife, if they come to me, I'm going to defend America. And I know exactly where they're coming from on one hand, but on the other hand, it really makes me kind of ill. First of all, I really understand them more than I ever did, because now I'm really kind of proud to be an American, and having had that experience of the 20th century, as deluded as I was about it, as idealistic as I was about it. It was a dream that was held by hundreds of thousands of people, and I guess when you all hold a dream together, I guess it kind of makes it kind of there, or at least makes it so it looks like it's there. So I was thinking about that, and I was proud of being part of that, and proud of being like some of the guys that were on these YouTube videos, these old the Vietnam era veterans saying their piece, and I was kind of proud of them, actually. But then on the other hand, thinking in a wider perspective, now they're standing up and they're being outraged. Where were they about being outraged when we unlawfully, illegally attacked Afghanistan, Iran, Libya? I mean, why weren't they sharpening their knives on YouTube videos and threatening back then? What about all the other atrocities, all the other violence, the rising police state, the completely being raped of our privacy, any semblance of privacy is an accident. Where were they on YouTube when those things were happening? I just hope it's not too late for people to start standing up and doing stuff. And I hope that rallying behind things like, damn, we're employing Satanists to work on our behalf? I mean, who are we then? I mean, Are we the heart of darkness that we can conjure up these demons to work on our behalf? My God, can't you see what we're getting into on this? Anyway, I wanted to talk about Jade Helm because I want to put this in context. The Army is all over the world. Our intelligence services are all over the world. They're working all over the world doing things on our behalf directed by senior level officials like Michael Aquino. Why do I call him Thomas? Maybe there's another famous, maybe he's a golfer or something, I don't know. But anyway.
Author, I think.
He might have been an author. But anyway, I've got a couple other news stories. I want to make sure that you remember that pedophilia, satanic ritual abuse, and the government's blackmailing people with this type of nefarious behavior is all over the world. So today, after I was watching my YouTube videos of my fellow American Vietnam-era kind of guys talking out about how horrible it was that the government was going to have Jade Helm. And I turned and I saw two recent cases of sexual abuse that are making the paper. This one just happens to deal with the US Army again. From the ColumbiaReports.com. And it said at least 54 Colombian girls sexually abused by immune U.S. military. U.S. soldiers and military contractors sexually abused at least 54 children in Colombia between 2003 and 2007, according to a recently released historic document on the country's conflict. This isn't all that happened. Later on it tells you there's a lot more people involved. These are the ones in the document. The suspects have allegedly not been prosecuted due to immunity clauses in bilateral agreements. The 800-page independent historic report was commissioned by the Colombian government to establish the causes and violent aggravators of the 50-year-long conflict they are negotiating to end. The document is to help negotiators determine who is responsible for more than 7 million victims of the armed conflict between the leftist rebels and the state while they were negotiating peace. And you can believe that both sides of those conflicts were supported by the same money pots. Now there's a person named Renan Vega, who's investigating the case on the behalf of the Colombian state. She says, quote, "There exists an abundant information about the sexual violence and absolute impunity thanks to the bilateral agreements and the diplomatic immunity of the United States officials," end quote. In this report, the historian cited one 2004 case in the central Colombian town of Melgar, where 53 underage girls were sexually abused by nearby stationed military contractors, quote, who, moreover, filmed the abuse and sold the films as pornographic material, end quote. So, you've got your military salary coming in there. You've got, you're a capitalist, so on the side you want to make a little more money. Why not sell porn of underage girls in Colombia? I mean, you're down there. Why not? If it's okay, if there's no morality, if you think that anything you do is okay depending on how you view it, or if you work for Thomas Aquino. Michael Aquino. Why am I saying that? Okay. Similar crimes, but possibly also never saw the light of court due to immunity agreement for American soldiers and military contractors agreed by Washington and Bogota. All right, I have to take a break a minute. And, we want to discuss, when we do these podcasts, I want to discuss reality. And here we have a contract between Bogota, whoever was in charge or whoever signed it on behalf of Bogota, Colombia, and then whoever signed it on behalf of Washington. Could have been Michael Aquino, who knows? But governments can't take away natural law rights. I'm telling you, there's no agreement that two people can make that allows women to be raped and have no justice. There's no way that two people can sign something and take away somebody else's rights. Governments don't give you rights. You have rights that are granted by, you just have them. They're granted by God. They're an unfolding of the universe. I mean, I really sound New Age on this, but you really have freedom. You have sovereignty. You can take it whenever you want to. You have to be careful they don't put you in a cage, but they're acting against natural law, and you can't go against natural law. So here we have this fictitious agreement agreed to by people outside of these families. It's like it's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. You can't do that, and these people don't get away with it. The soldiers that were named, I think his name was Cohen and Ruiz, they didn't get away with it. They're guilty of it, and they're guilty of it in moral law, in real natural law. They're guilty of it. Now, how natural law extracts its justice, I don't know whether it's karma. I don't know whether it's penance. I don't know whether it's you just have to some type of a reincarnation thing where you have to go through the ordeal of of the person you tormented. I don't know how it works. Maybe there's a point system. You get so many points, and then your consciousness blends back into the great vacuum of infinite consciousness. Who knows? I don't know how it works, but I know there's natural law, and I know we're governed by it. Here's how I know, and you can test this for yourself. Imagine there not being it there. Yeah, imagine that Aleister Crowley, big Satanist self, his motto was, "Do as thou wilt." I think he did whilst. Means do whatever you want. How does that work? How does that work in society? How does that work in a human family? How does that work in any context? And where does that lead? Well, I'll tell you where it leads. It leads you exactly where we're going. If we don't straighten this Satanist thing out, this pedophile network of Satanists, if we don't start protecting our children, this is where it's going. I mean, there's no more time to waste. It's going in that direction, and we have to act on behalf of natural law and do the right thing and stop it. That's the only way the universe is going to automatically right itself. You can't continue to have everybody do as thou wilt, perceive things as thou wilt, weigh things and give things a morality that they think they want to at that present moment. It doesn't work that way. You can't have a physical environment where that rule, it would be a snake pit. I mean, I don't know whether you can imagine how it would be. It would be well, first of all, the psychopaths are the only people that would survive it, because they're the only people that are uncaring and ruthless enough to even want to swim in those waters. I can't imagine if you were born into a society like that. You either get quickly psychopathic or die. And what we're talking about is the survival of the human race, not the psychopathic, satanistic overlords. We're talking about the survival of creative people, feeling people, loving people, people that really matter, not the predatory species of psychopaths that are practicing child trafficking all over the world, child murder, we've got to stop it. There is moral law. They didn't get away with it. There's no treaty between Bogota and Washington that can allow you to be raped with impunity. Because Bogota and Washington didn't have the right anyway. It was yours. It was yours. And you're entitled to use any kind of force that you would like to extract whatever you think would be justice in that situation, because natural law gives you that. Anyway, I just wanted to stop and say that. Let's continue. One case that was called most attention in Columbia media was that of a 12-year-old who in 2007 was raped by a US Army sergeant and former US military officer who was working in Melgar as a military contractor. Colombian prosecutors established that the girl had been drugged and subsequently raped inside the military base, of course we need to provide the facility, by U.S. Sergeant Michael J. Cohen and defense contractor Cesar Ruiz. And then the rapists were subsequently flown out of the country, of course on our dollar. Nevertheless, the rape victim, her little sister and mother were forced to flee to Melgar and eventually moved to the city of Medellin as forced loyal to the suspects were threatening the family and mother, told Colombian television. So they eventually moved to another city because forces loyal to the suspects. Now, forces loyal to the suspects, who's that? Is that the American military? Is that people who were friends of these two guys? I suspect it was government officials in some capacity, although, I wasn't there. They were so threatened they had to leave town. According to a news website, El Tourbillon, the case of the 12-year-old girl was not the only one. In 2006, there were 23 reported cases of sexual abuse. And Colombian women have been registered as victims of sex crimes within the context of the conflict in the decades that it lasted. And I think they've been over there for 50 years we've been in Colombia. First of all, we actually wrecked the countryside, sprayed something over the crops. They can't even grow cocaine leaves in Colombia now. Cocaine is made in Colombia, but it's grown in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, so I'm told. Back to this Vega person, Renan Vega. She says, there exists an abundant information about the sexual violence and absolute impunity thanks to the liberal agreements and the diplomatic immunity of United States officials. And supposedly, here's a quote by the U.S. Sergeant Michael J. Cohen to the mother of the 12-year-old rape victim. He said, quote, yes, we took her, and yes, we raped her. So what? And so that's your military in action. I know that all the people that serve in the military, probably most of them are so much more honorable than I am, that I would be ashamed in their presence. But there's a cabal or a group or an influence in there that's not honorable. It's immoral. And I think if I had anything to do with the Army or any of these undercover agencies, I think I'd be really wondering about who I'm taking orders from, realizing that if you're following orders, it doesn't absolve one bit of your moral responsibility for your action. If you're following orders, it means nothing. The universe doesn't even look at that. It's what you did. It's what you stood for. It's your legacy. Anyway, let me move back to the UK for another story. This is an old story. I can remember this 20 years ago. It's about a place called the Kincora Boys' Home. And this is a boys' home in Ireland. I found this on ansionachfion.com, I believe. And it talks about the Concordia Boys' Home scandal. And the reason it's getting back in the news now is because the boys, the girls, the people who were raped there are, I don't know, maybe their mind control's wearing off, maybe they're coming forth in numbers, maybe the fact that Cyril Smith and Leon Britton are now really having to face the ridicule and at least the alternative press. Maybe that's why they're coming out. But anyway, let me read you the story. During the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this is 30 years, during this period, British political, military, and ethno-religious interests converged around a ritualistic pedophile grouping in the city of Belfast, one that exploited young children for the benefit of locally based or garrisoned officials, diplomats, politicians, soldiers, police officers, judges, and terrorists. It's a friendly kind of place they had over there in Belfast for the English people that had to go over there. And also the locals. I'm sure they're all... the people that fight these wars, they're all controlled by the same people. And the people that control both sides are pedophiles. They're Satanists. So they've got to have... It's like having a local motel in your area. If you're driving through, you can stop in and stay in a motel. You don't have to fly home every night. That's why I guess they have these things located throughout the countryside. Okay, especially when all evidence points to the alleged intelligence gatherer being a secondary... They claimed that one of the reasons they were doing this is to blackmail people and gather intelligence. But then it goes on to say, when all evidence points to the alleged intelligence gathering being a secondary objective or simply a smokescreen covering up what was occurring, a frequently rumored ring of child abusers at the heart of Britain's establishment. Oh, surprise. We don't have to be royals. Encompassing members of the aristocracy, civil service. Why does that have civil service and armed forces exploiting the chaos of the conflict in Ireland to carry out the sexual, physical, and psychological abuse of children on a massive scale? We don't do anything little. From today's Guardian newspaper, quote, MI5 is facing allegations that it was complicit in the sexual abuse of children, the High Court in Northern Ireland would hear on Tuesday. Victims of the abuse were taking legal action to force a full independent inquiry with the power to compel witnesses to testify and the security service to hand over documents. Unless we all get active and bitch and support this, that'll never happen. They'll send Judge Palfrey up there, and she'll say, it's Ella Draper's fault. Goes on to say, there are long-standing claims that MI5 blocked one or more police investigations into Kincora in the 1970s in order to protect its own intelligence gathering operation, a terrible indictment which raises the specter of countless vulnerable boys having faced further years of brutal abuse. All right, this goes back to the original question. We're talking about intelligence services that work for you that do satanic things. And they have to cover it up because it's black stuff. They do it on your behalf. Against who? If Satan's on your side, who are you fighting? Okay. There is credible evidence, and therefore is arguable, that the security forces and security services were aware of these abuse, permitted it to continue, and colluded in protecting the individuals involved from investigation or prosecution. There is now irrefutable evidence that previous inquiries were deliberately engineered and manipulated to mislead Parliament by concealing the role of government agencies in covering up the abuses. Well, it's horrible. Thinking about it from over here, looking over there, it's a long way off, it's a long way to go. But the suffering that this puts into people, the suffering of that this puts into people for a lifetime, and those are the lucky ones. Remember, these scandals involve abuse, they involve torture, they involve murder. And the people, the victims, if they're not killed or maimed, they're scarred for life emotionally. And their lives just become a living hell. Now they're coming forward. They're coming forward at great personal risk to try to get this stopped, because believe me, if it happened back then, it's happening in a more grander scale now. Actually, I was looking at a statistic today that said human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world, second only to the drug trade. So that's what's happening, and it's happening to probably millions a year. But it only comes home when you know somebody, when you can listen to somebody who's actually been there. I've got a little tape I want to play of somebody who was kidnapped from Kincora and brought to London and sexually abused. Let's hear his story.
My name is Richard Kerr, and I'm 53, and I believe my first time being trafficked to England was on February of 1977.
Richard Kerr has suffered for over 30 years in silence, blocking out the horrors of his past at the hands of what he describes as very powerful people. As a teenager, he was introduced to the world of Westminster. He says he was trafficked from Northern Ireland and that this picture was taken by one of his abusers.
I was used as a boy toy. I was an object, a sexual object.
Rumours of an alleged paedophile ring in the top echelons of society have been circulating for years. But for the first time, Richard's account of what happened to him as a boy links 3 locations. Dolphin Square, a luxury complex popular with MPs and civil servants. Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast, where boys were systematically abused. And Elm Guesthouse, a former gay brothel where young children are also said to have been molested. We brought Richard back to England from America, along with his counsellor, to revisit his past. His memories were vivid and distressing.
I'm sorry.
A cottage industry of conspiracy theories has built up around this story, but Richard insists a VIP paedophile ring did exist, and it's time for the truth to be told.
They were men who had control and power over others.
They were politicians, you believe?
Some I do.
His story starts in Belfast in the 1970s at the now notorious Kincora Boys' Home. He was placed in care from the age of 5 and sent to Kincora at 14, where he was abused. There he claims he and 2 other boys were hand-picked to be trafficked to London and sexually abused by further men. Both of them, he says, have since taken their own lives.
We were throwaways. That's how I felt. I felt a throwaway. I was exploited.
Richard says in 1977, when he was 15, he was put on a ferry to Liverpool, abused by a man there, then escorted to Manchester and later sent to London. He claims he was picked up in a car at King's Cross Station, taken to a hotel close by, and forced to have sex with multiple men.
I had no way to get to England. I had no money. You know, I was under the state care. They were responsible for me. I had no one else to turn to. This is the place that I remember very well, and the memories that I tried to block many, many years ago.
How do you feel about the boy you remember here?
Very emotional. Very painful. Sorry. I'm scared.
He says he's faced years of intimidation and is still being warned not to talk by people he believes are connected to the alleged paedophile ring. Some of his sharpest memories are of the fear he felt when he says he was visited by detectives on 2 separate occasions and told to keep quiet.
They told me to stop talking about Kincora, and that they intimidated me here. There is another place where they in Preston, Lancashire, they told me they could put me away.
He claims he was trafficked across the UK, including to Rochdale, Lancaster, Manchester and Wolverhampton. But it's here, at Elm Guesthouse in South London, that he says he faced his most violent experience. It was raided by police in 1982. Newspapers at the time said that at least 3 MPs were questioned. It's claimed the late Sir Cyril Smith was a visitor. It was being used as a gay brothel, and it was alleged children as young as 10 were abused. It's the first time Richard's been back, and the flashbacks come fast.
I was tied up here. I do remember that. I don't know why I was tied up, but I was tied up. With my hands behind my back. I do remember that. Laying down, and they took photographs. Other men were here. Other men came into the room. It just wasn't this one man. There were other men here.
In the 80s, it was reported officers found whips, chains and ropes.
I don't mean to be this way. It happened. You know, I just don't mean to be. It's just holding on to all this sometimes. And I can't believe this happened.
In the 1970s in Piccadilly Circus, Richard said he was picked out from a group of boys sitting upstairs inside the wimpy fast food restaurant.
Would you describe the activity round here as a paedophile ring?
Oh, yeah, there's no question about that. Oh yes, definitely.
Why are you so convinced of that?
Because of the people that I was involved with. And the boys were in groups, even though we were spread across the tables. And the way they set it up, the clients and locations.
One of the locations he claims he was taken to in a taxi was an apartment complex in the heart of Westminster, known as Dolphin Square. It is now at the nexus of the Met Police's Operation Midland, which is also looking into alleged murders.
I could have been 16, 15, 17. I remember going in with this guy, and he told me to sit down and relax and explain about his glasses. And he said he had a Waterford Crystal, and he wanted me to have a brandy, and we had more brandy. And then we had a sexual encounter in here.
Did you ever meet any of the men that have been named to have had alleged contact with young boys?
I just don't want to get into that right now. I really don't. I'm talking to my attorneys, legal.
And why is that? Why don't you want to talk about it yet?
I'm still concerned. There are some people still around, and I'm concerned. Most of these people were very well off, but most of them had positions of power that had influence over others.
Why don't you feel yet, after all these years, that you can name your abusers who were in power?
I'm still in some fear, even though I'm willing to take the courage. I need to know that I can have faith in our government.
And central to achieving that trust, he says, is getting the government to acknowledge what he calls the untold story of Kincora Boys' Home, that he claims goes way beyond Northern Ireland. In 1981, 3 senior staff at Kincora were convicted of abusing 11 boys. There's been 2 judge-led inquiries, but allegations of a high-level cover-up continue. Despite claims that abuse in Kincora was connected to England, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, has so far ruled out including it in the official child abuse inquiry.
Right now, when they're not willing to bring Kincora into Westminster, that just tells that the message it sends to me is that there's some kind of cover-up, and there has been.
It's claimed British security services knew about the crimes in Belfast but did nothing to stop them, using the knowledge to blackmail and extract intelligence from influential men. In 1975, as the Troubles were taking hold, a young army intelligence officer called Brian Gemmell was working undercover and tried to blow the whistle. We brought Richard to meet him for the first time.
You must be Richard.
Yes,
I'm Brian Richard. It's good to meet you. Come on in. Let's talk. Come on in.
Brian says he put in an official report about Kincora to a senior MI5 officer, but to his astonishment, he claims he was ordered to stop digging and forget about it.
That's the thing that hits me. That if I'd really pushed the thing through in 75, 76, you could have been rescued. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. I've been in a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and I have survival guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it's a calling. I believe it's a calling, and I'm not here. This is less selfish of myself. I'm not here to think of me.
Right.
I get peace from that.
Yes. And I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
But it's hard to heal without the truth, and Brian now believes to establish that Kincora must be added to the UK inquiry.
Why do you think it should be?
I think 2 words, Richard Kerr. I think Richard's transporting over to the United Kingdom mainland to be abused, rather than just being abused in Northern Ireland, speaks volumes. It ties the 2 together. Here's a Kincora boy that knows what goes on in Dolphin Square.
Do you think there are still efforts to try and cover up?
I do.
Richard is open about the fact he went on in his adult life in London to be paid for sex with men. It was, he says, the only life he knew. He later emigrated to America.
Would you concede that you became a male prostitute?
I would answer it this way. I didn't become. That's what they made me to be. I had no awareness that I would be that. They shaped me, groomed me, and that's what my life was.
He says he's decided to speak out now for his 2 friends trafficked with him, no longer alive to tell their tales.
It's not about me. It's about the voices that didn't have a voice, and I don't know, my spirit is driving me.
And he has this message for the Home Secretary, Theresa May.
I want those who are responsible brought to justice. Yes, we can't fail in this. We just can't. If we do this now, if we fail on this, we are allowing this to continue. That they can get away from this because people have decided to turn the other way.
The idea those inside the corridors of power were part of a sophisticated UK-wide paedophile ring has been dismissed by some, but Richard is adamant there was one and that he is living proof.
You know, that's exactly right. Richard's exactly right. You can't fail to stop this. Imagine a world that this goes on, unabated, and you can't do anything about it because you're surveilled. You can't talk out about it. You can't express this. You can't learn about this. You can't teach about this. Well, that's the world that's fast approaching if we don't do something. We had some ideas in podcast 137. If you're interested in my crazy ideas, which you must be if you've gotten this far, you can go there and see my ideas on things we can do to militate against this crazy satanic infection that we seem to have as humans. Anyway, I want to spend the rest of the hour, or this new hour, going back to my buddy Michael Aquino. Let's hear a little bit about Michael Aquino from a YouTube video. And I think this is the first, I was watching this video as the first time I'd ever heard of him before I investigated him very far. Let's take a look at the General Michael Aquino.
Intelligence agencies have infiltrated and created some satanic groups, with the resurgence of these groups beginning in 1966, particularly with the birth of the Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey. LaVey studied criminology in San Francisco and worked in the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. He also worked as an informant for Interpol. Prior to the Church of Satan, LaVey ran a group called the Magic Circle. LaVey's most famous associate is the National Security Agency General Michael Aquino. At the time of his membership in LaVey's group, Aquino was an Army specialist in intelligence and psychological warfare. In 1973, he became the executive officer of the 306th Psychological Operations Battalion, contemporary with his founding of the Church of Set. General Michael Aquino wrote, "From PSYOP to Mind War, the Psychology of Victory." Aquino's thesis stated that enemy populations could be subdued by inflicting a state of psychological terror and feelings of imminent destruction. He discusses the use of psychotronic weapons or electromagnetic weapons that influence the mind. Capitulation could be induced without firing a shot by extremely low-frequency signals piggybacked on broadcasts of radio, TV, or microwave communications in order to influence and manipulate the thoughts and feelings of the target population. During the 1960s, he was prominent in the Church of Satan and a close friend of Anton LaVey until he started his own Church of Set. A police intelligence report dated July 1st, 1981 reads, quote, "The Church of Set is a group of hundreds of members that operates on a national level. Michael Aquino is the official head and rules through a council of 9 who are in fact his lieutenants," unquote. At least 2 members of the Council of 9 at that time were members of Army intelligence. In the late 1980s, Aquino was accused by the San Francisco Police Department of being involved in a satanic child molestation ring centered on the daycare at the Presidio military base where Aquino was stationed at the time. Probable victims numbered at 68, many of whom had contracted venereal disease. 22 families filed $66 million in claims against the Army, claiming that criminal charges against Michael Aquino were dropped due to pressure from the Army. General Aquino admitted to renting the German castle where the Nazi SS were formed and reenacting the secret ceremony among fellow intelligence officers dressed in full Nazi regalia. General Aquino is now the highest-ranking officer in the National Security Agency, along with General Black and General Hayden. It is important to remember that General Aquino is first and foremost a military intelligence officer with over 40 years' experience in counterinsurgency operations and an expert in psychological warfare. General Aquino's psychological warfare campaign has started or infiltrated cults and other closed systems as part of a concerted effort to control large numbers of people and to destabilize the centers of constitutional and legal authority both here in the United States and in other nations. This methodology is part of a concerted plan that spans several generations. The Church of Satan and the Church of Set, as well as other cults and mainstream organizations, are closed systems with their own belief systems that are insular and separate from the reality that most people take for granted. These closed systems allow large numbers of people to be manipulated into performing antisocial acts that most members of the greater society would not contemplate. Aquino first participated in MKUltra-related activities in Vietnam as part of the Phoenix program in the 1960s. These ongoing MKUltra operations are functioning as a counterinsurgency and infiltration operation aimed at destabilizing the United States and other industrialized nations. The following cults have been used by General Aquino or his associates to continue MKUltra operations outside of the laboratory. The mass suicides at Jonestown of 890 people had similar threads, a cult with sinister connections. Jim Jones, who had connections to the CIA, set up his utopian experiment on the same land the CIA had used to train mercenaries to fight in Angola. According to investigators, the Jonestown experiment was conceived of by Dr. Lawrence Laird Layton, staffed by him and financed by Layton. The African-American cult had at its core a Caucasian inner council composed of Layton and his family. Layton was a chemist in the Manhattan Project and head of the Army's Chemical Warfare Research Division in the 1950s. The People's Temple cult took over the Mendocino State Hospital as a part of a government pilot project to evaluate the feasibility of deinstitutionalizing mental patients. After a reduction in state funding, most of the patients at the Mendocino State Psychiatric Hospital were released into the custody of the People's Temple. Congressman Leo Ryan was assassinated in his attempt to investigate the cult. The pathologist in Guyana reported 80 to 90% of the victims' bodies had fresh needle marks. Other victims had been shot or strangled. In 1981, the survivors sued the former head of the CIA for, quote, enhancing the economic and political powers of James Warren Jones, unquote, and of conducting mind control and drug experimentation on the Temple flock. The Manson family was associated with the Process Church, which according to the Utah Department of Public Safety moved to southern Utah and changed their name to the Foundation. In a 1990 internal memo authored by church authority Glenn L. Pace, allegations were made of ritual abuse and human sacrifice. Pace writes that he has met with 60 victims of ritual abuse, but there were probably 2 to 3 times as many victims. 53 were female and 7 were male, 8 of which were children. All are members of the Mormon Church. 45 victims alleged they witnessed or participated in human sacrifice. The majority were abused by relatives. All had developed psychological problems such as multiple personality disorder. Quote, the memories come in layers. The first might be of incest. Another layer might well be the memory of seeing people hurt or even killed. Then they remember having seen babies killed. Another layer is realizing that they participated in the sacrifices. One of the most painful memories may be that they even sacrificed their own baby. I have only seen those coming forth to get help. They are in their 20s and 30s for the most part. I can only assume that it is expanding geometrically. and am horrified by the numbers represented by the generation who are now children and teenagers." Unquote. Dr. Joseph Mengele found that trauma bonding and mind control work best when the victim is forced to kill someone they love, usually a twin. The Franklin conspiracy refers to a sexual blackmail operation and savings and loan fraud that began in Omaha, Nebraska in the early 1980s. Larry King, a 300-pound pedophile, operated a national child prostitution network that catered to wealthy patrons and Republican Party insiders. King was one of the fastest rising stars in the Republican Party. He sang the national anthem at the Republican Convention in 1984 and 1988. King and his associates defrauded Franklin's savings and loan of $40 million and used the residents of Boys Town and other children to videotape powerful and influential men and women engaged in sex acts with minors. These blackmail operations took place during fundraising parties for the Republican Party. Those involved stayed late for the after party that included drugs and sex with minors. The strategy of early MKUltra was to use sexual blackmail operations that targeted political figures in order to ensure continued funding from legislators. Victims who came forward testified that King and his associates performed satanic rituals and human sacrifices. Many of the children who came forward with their stories have since been murdered or imprisoned. The most prominent and vocal victim has been held in solitary confinement longer than any other person in Nebraska history. Larry King served 2 years for fraud and was promptly employed by his good friend, the editor of an Omaha newspaper.
Well, that's a little information about Michael Aquino. Also, it ended with the scandal in Nebraska revolving around Larry King. It's written up in the Franklin cover-up. If you're interested in that story, it's another child abuse, same kind of thing. But let's get back to Michael Aquino. On one of the sites I was reading, it said he's the former head of U.S. military psychological warfare operations before being promoted to PSYOP chief. Aquino was expelled from the Church of Satan for being too evil, and then implicated in one of the most horrific child abuse scandals in American history. So we're talking about a guy who was expelled from the Church of Satan for being too evil. All right, now we know a little bit about the Church of Satan from Hampstead. We know that they do things like they import newborn babies so that they can ritualistically kill them. They drain the blood, they eat the meat. They make shoes out of the hide. They have sex with children, all the way down to the age of, there's no age limit. But he was thrown out of the Church of Satan for being too evil. I mean, that's pretty amazing. That's a pretty amazing feat.
Can't get much more evil than that, I wouldn't think.
No, I think that's about the extent of evil you can have on the planet. So anyway, let me read you a little bit more about Michael Aquino. There are other branches of Satanism. On August 14, 1987, the San Francisco police staged a raid on the Russian Hills home of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, an active-duty U.S. Reserve officer, and his wife Lilith. The raid was in response to allegations that Aquino's home had been the scene of a brutal child rape of a 4-year-old girl. The principal suspect in the child molestation, a Baptist minister named Gary Hambright, was indicted in September 1987 on charges that he committed, quote, lewd and lascivious, unquote, acts with 6 boys and 4 girls ranging in the age from 3 to 7 years old. It's a Baptist minister. At the time of the alleged incidents, police believe Hambright was responsible for 58 separate incidents of child rape during 1986. Hambright was employed at a child care center servicing the US Army base in Presidio. According to an article in October 30th, 1987 issue of the San Francisco Examiner, one of the victims have identified Lieutenant Colonel Aquino and his wife as participants in the child rape. According to the victim, the Aquinos had filmed scenes of the child being fondled by Hambright in a bathtub at Aquino's Russian Hills home. The child's detailed description of the house in which the incident had occurred led police to the Aquino residence, which doubles as a Satanic church, where they confiscated 38 videotapes, photo negatives, and other evidence that the home had been the hub of a pedophile ring operating in and around the Army base. For reasons that still remain cloudy, Aquino and his wife were never indicted. Aquino claimed that he had been in Washington, D.C. at the time, enrolled in a year-long reserve officers course at the National Defense University. Despite his absence from the Bay Area, Aquino had maintained his Russian Hills home, residence, church, and had made frequent trips back to the West Coast. As a result of the flap over the Hambright indictment and the raid on the Aquino home, Lieutenant Colonel Aquino was transferred from the Presidio, where he had been deputy director of the Reserve Training Program, to the U.S. Michael Aquino, USAR, maintains top secret security clearance. Queried by the San Francisco Chronicle, a Pentagon public affairs officer, Major Greg Rickson, told reporters Bill Wallace and John Whittinger, quote, "The question is whether he is trustworthy or can do the job. There's nothing that would indicate, in this case, that there is any problem we should be concerned about." Major Rickson was not only responding to the question about Aquino's suspected role in the pedophile ring at Presidio, also at issue was Aquino's position as high priest of the Satanic cult called the Temple of Set. Founded in San Francisco as a 1975 split out of the decade-old Church of Satan of Anton, LaVey, the Temple of Set is now headquartered in St. Louis. He started the Temple of Set because they asked him to leave the Temple of Satan because he was too evil. In Aquino's own words from a Temple of Set recruiting document, quote, "It was not until the late 19th century that the so-called, quote, black arts, end quote, began to be tolerated, and then only in their most sanitized and pious form. From Freemasonry came a ceremonial magical offshoot, Rosicrucianism, which became increasingly more sophisticated in the Rosicrucian Society of England, and then in the famous Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn." I want to tell you a little bit about the Golden Dawn. In 1904, an adept of the Golden Dawn named Aleister Crowley broke away from that disintegrating body to form his own order of the Astrium Argentinum. To the Rosicrucian ceremonial magical philosophy of the Golden Dawn, Crowley added first a strong emphasis in attainment of the highest level of self-consciousness, knowledge, conversation with the holy guardian angel, and we know who that holy guardian angel is, and the Masonic sexual magic practice of Germany's Order of Oriental Templars. The latter practices, together with Crowley's cavalier lifestyle, brought him public notoriety. His organization survived his 1947 death only in highly fragmented and doctrinarily degenerated fractions. Now, I don't know if you know about Aleister Crowley, but he called himself the Beast. He also called himself the evilest man ever. He boasts of buggering and killing 180 young boys. And I think he liked this practice because he felt that the anus had some magical property. Maybe all Satanists think this, because they do seem to prefer rectal relations. I've heard it said that he thought it was like a Stargate, but who knows what he meant by that and how metaphorical it was or how. Anyway, let's go back to formal disciples of Aquino and the Temple of Set charged in 1982 that the Army Reserve officer had recently steered the group into a virulently neo-Nazi direction, extolling the virtues of Hitler's own occult beliefs and even staging a ceremonial event at the Bavarian castle where Heinrich Himmler had staged pagan rituals. Indeed, Aquino also referenced the 3 pre-Nazi fascist terrorist groups, including the infamous Thule Society, as the models upon which he had established the Temple of Set. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm really interested in looking into a little more of what Aquino was involved in. I wanted to add a little something about the age of the children molested. I was watching Code 222's videos, which is a website I recommended. It's changed its name to, I think, Guidance 2222, spelt really differently than the one I gave you. And it was a man talking about the Jewish Talmudic law. And I guess this is an ancient law. We're dealing with ancient ritual practices here. I think it all can be traced back to the ancient Temple of Isis and that cult, the Canaanite cult of Isis. That's where the cremation of care ceremony comes from, that the Satanists in California practice every year with the inbred elites. I was talking about the Talmudic law. Now, the Talmudic law is an ancient Jewish law. Now, Jewish people are getting a bad rap here because most Jewish people that I know are wonderful, and many of them are on our side fighting this tyranny. But this ancient law gave rise to the synagogue of Satan, which I believe is a kind of a subset under this Talmudic law. And according to Talmudic law, raping someone 3 years old and older is not a crime. That's fine to do. You can do that. And if they're younger than 3, it's a non-event, because the idea is that the hymen, if it's a girl, will grow back over before she grows up. So it's twisted as hell. It's really twisted as hell. It's hard to get into the mindset. It's so twisted. And we're talking about a guy here in the form of Michael Aquino that was asked to leave the Church of Satan because he was too evil. Well, anyway, most of the information I've been reading in the second hour came from the Aquarian Conspiracy and an Executive Intelligence Review. And it's a collection of articles put together by Lyndon LaRouche. I don't know whether you know who that is. He ran for president a couple times. And I wish I would have been aware when he was running for president. I would have probably backed him. But to me at the time, he seemed a little bit, I don't know, maybe moralistic or right-wing. Now, as I see what's happening without this type of structure, I can see how Lyndon LaRouche was arguing. So anyway, here's an article that's in this document, written by Linda Goldston. It starts out, were children really being sexually abused at the Presidio? The Army didn't want to believe it. The prosecution didn't think they could make a jury believe it, but the parents believed it. And we get into the story. Even before Joyce Tobin arrived at the daycare center on November 14, 1986, she suspected that something was wrong. Her neighbor, Karen Thomas, had just called to say that Joyce's 3-year-old son had begged to go home with her when she picked up her own youngster at the Child Development Center that morning. Joyce's son had said he didn't want to stay for a daycare after his preschool class ended. When Thomas said she couldn't take him with her, the Tobin boy turned to his preschool teacher and asked if he could stay with her. But she had no choice. Joyce Tobin was at the dentist across town and had arranged for her son to be taken from his preschool class at the CDC to hourly care until she could pick him up. Until the boy started preschool 2 months earlier, he had been left at the center once or twice a month for 2 years. It was only the second time he had been left in hourly care since. September, both times while his mother had medical appointments. The preschool and hourly care programs were both run by the US Army at the Presidio of San Francisco, a sprawling compound of turn-of-the-century wood and brick buildings, headquarters of the 6th Army, the place that motorists glimpse through the pines on their way to the Golden Gate Bridge. On the day that changed her life and the lives of her family, Joyce Tobin arrived at the Presidio Daycare Center at 2:30 p.m. Her son appeared to be napping with several other children, and the teacher, Gary Hambright, was sitting at the table in the room. When Joyce asked how her son had been that day, Hambright said the boy had been upset and had not eaten his lunch. He called the child a, quote, darling little boy, and suggested that she bring him to daycare center every other day so that the boy could, quote, get used to him. A lot of 3- and 4-year-olds had trouble coming to this daycare room, Hambright told her. He suggested that they were intimidated by the older children in the class. That night, while watching television with the older brother, the 3-year-old started playing with his penis, pulling it forward with both hands and letting it go. Quote, Mr. Gary do it, he said, and kept at it. His brother ran for the mother, who was talking to the neighbor in the front doorway. Trying to keep her voice calm, Joyce asked her son what he was talking about. The child's reply was terse and grim. Quote, he touched my penis with his hand, and he bit my penis. End quote. The boy made a chomping sound with his mouth. Asked if, quote, Mr. Gary had done anything else, the boy said, quote, he put a pencil in my hole in my bottom. He'd do that to me. He hurt me, and I cry and I cry. If you guys are familiar with Hampstead and what we've been talking about in Hampstead and what those kids were saying in Hampstead, this is going to sound remotely familiar. Back to the story. Joyce Tobin was unsure what to think. It seemed too impossible and horrible to be true. She said later, quote, I also thought how awful it would be to accuse someone of this if it were not true, end quote. She watched her young son bite his nails and turn his head away. He seemed nervous and upset. When her husband, Captain Mike Tobin, came home, the couple decided to observe their son over the weekend. They agreed they would not question him, but would wait and see if he said anything more. At bedtime, Joyce, who was trained as a nurse, examined the boy's anus. It seemed a little red. Does this sound like Ella Draper and Abraham Christie? They wanted to get the information out, but it's really delicate, and it has to be done correctly. Back to the story. That night, the boy came to their bedroom crying. He said he was scared. He said he wanted to sleep with them. During the next few days, what seemed at first, quote, too impossible and horrible to be true, end quote, would not go away. The boy continued to talk about Mr. Gary hurting him. The following Tuesday, on November 18th, Joyce Tobin was driving through the Presidio with the boy when they came to the intersection where she would have turned to go to the daycare center. He raised himself up out of his car seat as if he were attempting to get out and started to cry. Quote, "Are you taking me to daycare?" he asked. Quote, I don't want to go to daycare. Mr. Gary hurt me and I cry. Reassured that they were not going to daycare center, the boy calmed down. The mother could not. The incident convinced her that she should contact the daycare center. On Wednesday, she called the director, Diana Curl, and asked for an appointment to discuss her son's allegation. Despite the seriousness of the complaint, Curl said she couldn't see Joyce until Friday, 2 days later. Within half an hour of the call, Joyce was called at home by one of her son's preschool teachers wanting to know what the problem was. The daycare center staff had been told immediately about Joyce's call. Authorities did not search the center until Friday. Joyce Tobin never got to meet with Diana Curl. The case broke before then. On Thursday, Mike Tobin spoke with a chaplain at the Presidio who contacted the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Officers from the CID made an appointment to interview and videotape the boy about his allegations. After a videotaped interview, on the morning of November 21st, the Tobin son was examined at the Child Adolescent Sexual Abuse Referral Center at San Francisco General Hospital. The Child Adolescent Sexual Abuse Referral Center reviews more than 700 cases of suspected sexual abuse every year. Among other things, the staff had often heard children describe anal rape as having a pencil put up their bottoms. When Dr. Kevin Coulter examined Tobin's son, he observed that the child's anus dilated to a wider dilation than normal. Coulter had conducted more than 300 examinations of children. His conclusion was that such rapid and wide dilation was caused by trauma to the anus and rectum, consistent with penetration. The Tobin's 3-year-old son had been sexually abused, anally raped. A flurry of meetings at the Presidio followed the revelation that the Tobin boy had been abused. But for all the activity, the Army seemed in no hurry to proceed with the case. It took the Army 12 days to form a strategy group, and it took the Army almost a month to notify the parents of other children who had been in, quote, Mr. Gary's class, that the incident had taken place, that their children might be at risk. Nearly a year would pass before more than 59 other victims' children between the ages of 3 and 7 had been identified, and the allegations would be made by parents that several more children were molested even after the investigation had begun. Daycare centers under state jurisdiction are routinely closed when an abuse incident was confirmed, but the Presidio Center stayed open for more than a year after the Tobin boy said Mr. Gary had hurt him. A strategy meeting on December 1st set the tone for the case. The meeting was attended by all the brass from the Presidio, representatives of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and staff from the Child Adolescent Sexual Abuse Referral Center, which I'm going to refer to as the Center. The center workers told the Army to expect multiple victims, so many that the center could not offer its help. But the Army didn't want to believe that, says the center worker who attended the meeting. 5 days later, on December 15th, letters were mailed to 242 parents whose children were in Hambright's classes. Quote, the commander of the Presidio of San Francisco has been appraised of a single incident of alleged child sexual abuse reported to have occurred at the Presidio Child Development Center. We have no reason to believe that other children have been victimized. End quote. Many parents who received the letter took the Army at its word. Many of them didn't learn until the following April, after the Tobins and other parents forced the Army to send out another letter that their children had been victims. Other parents found out right away. The children had begun to talk, and they kept talking. That was the problem. They kept saying things that no one, especially not the Army, wanted to hear. They kept mentioning other people besides Mr. Gary, other locations beside the daycare center. Among the allegations, some of the children said they were taken away from the daycare center to private homes on the Presidio, where they were sexually abused. 2 houses were singled out on the Army post, and at least 1 home off post in San Francisco. One girl said she played poo-poo baseball at the home of her female teachers. The girl said the game involved throwing feces at the teacher. Other children talked about playing the goo-goo game with Mr. Gary. It involved Hambright having the children urinate and defecate on him. Then he would do the same to them. Sometimes the children said they were forced to drink urine and eat feces. Some said they had blood smeared on their bodies. Some children said they had guns pointed at them. Others said they were told they would, or their parents would be killed if they told what happened. The 3-year-old boy said he was sexually abused on his first visit to the center. That day was also his birthday. Now, this is new stuff. We didn't know that the Satanists got into this satological kind of stuff, but it really doesn't surprise me. And it shouldn't surprise you either if you're keeping up with the cases that we've been looking at. Back to the text. A 3-year-old girl said Mr. Gary used special pens, black, blue, pink, and red, to doodle on her, starting with her legs and moving up over her genitals. The same child said she saw one of her friends at the center cry when Mr. Gary's friend, a woman, pointed a gun at the friend. There were 5 confirmed cases of chlamydia, a sexually transmitted disease, including 2 of the 4 daughters of one family. A preliminary test of one boy for AIDS came back positive. Further tests revealed that he did not have the disease, but fear of AIDS tormented parents for months. Despite the rumors and allegations, the Army, the FBI, and the US Attorney's Office were united in wanting a simple pedophile case. The Army wanted the matter over with. The prosecutors wanted the case they could win. The more unusual the allegations, they felt, the harder it would be to win in court. So on January 5, 1987, Gary Willard Hambright was arrested. Hambright, 35, was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. After moving to the Bay Area in 1977 from his home in Tacoma, Washington, he worked as a substitute teacher in San Francisco schools before taking a job at the daycare center in 1985. At his arraignment, he described himself as a, quote, educator, not a criminal. His close friend, Gordon Grover, a beauty salon owner, said the thin, pale man with blonde hair was probably one of the most gentle people you will ever know. Quote, he's always got time to give the kids a hug when they're crying, Grover said. He's just really a kind person. After the arrest, Hambright took part-time jobs cleaning houses and washing windows. He lived with friends and continued to be closely associated with Dolores Street Baptist Church in San Francisco. The indictment that Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Gray had sought from the grand jury charged Hambright with molesting only one child. He was accused of sodomy, oral copulation, and committing a lewd and lascivious act on a child. In March, 3 months after Hambright's arrest, the charges were dismissed. U.S. District Court Judge William Schwarzer refused to allow the admission of so-called hearsay statements, specifically the comments the Tobin boy made to his brother and mother, and to the nurse and the doctor who examined him about the abuse. Several states allow exceptions to the hearsay rules in child abuse cases, but federal courts and California states courts do not, and apparently they don't do it in the UK either. Schwarzer refused the hearsay evidence on March 4th and ruled that the Tobin boy would not qualify as a competent witness because of his age. On March 20th, the U.S. Attorney Office asked that the charges be dismissed without prejudice, meaning they could be refiled if new evidence emerged. Prosecutor Gray told the judge she had 12 more children saying the same things as the Tobin boy. Gray had counted on the judge allowing the admission of statements the Tobin boy made to his brother on the day of the first said Mr. Gary hurt him, as well as similar comments made to the nurses and doctors who examined him. The medical evidence and the perfect witness parents made even more confident. Joyce Tobin was a nurse. Mike Tobin was a West Point graduate and a nuclear engineer. But the Army's investigation of the Tobin boys' allegation had gotten off to a shaky start when Army Criminal Investigative Special Agent Mark Remsen was assigned to interview the child. Remsen had never interviewed a child younger than 8 years old, and while Army regulations require that the interview be taped, Remsen had never used videotape in the interview. The regulation was later changed, but the damage had been done. The videotape was to be singled out repeatedly as an example of how the children had been coached and prodded to tell their stories. And we know a little bit about the coaching and prodding since we're familiar with the Hampstead case. Joyce Tobin, according to court's record, said that during the interview, quote, apparently in an attempt to establish rapport with my son, the CID investigator said that Mr. Gary was bad and should be spanked. He said this numerous times. Thereafter, in a week that followed, when my son spoke about Mr. Gary, he described Mr. Gary as a bad and said he should be spanked. Prior to the CID interview, my son had never said anything like that or attempted to make any value judgment about what had happened to him. He just reported that what had happened to him. With the current charges dismissed, Gray's attempt at a single pedophile case had failed. The court would not hear of the Presidio again until the end of September 1987. The Tobins were disappointed but not defeated. They had been calling and writing congressmen calling a meeting with the Army officials at the Presidio. By April, another battle had shaped up outside the courtroom. The Army insisted that the daycare center was safe, that all of the victims had been identified. Parents feared otherwise because their children had mentioned people other than Hambright, people who still worked at the daycare center. At first, it was the Tobins alone who kept asking, was this done? Did you check on that? What about the other children? By April, the Tobins had been joined by the Runyons and the Adams-Thompsons, the Dorseys, the Foxes. Most had not met before. They were to meet many times in the months to come. Their first priority was to get another letter mailed to the parents of other children who had attended the daycare center. The Army saw no need for that. Why are you doing this? Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, the Director of Personnel and Community Activities, asked Mike Tobin. And he said, because parents need to know what's happening. This is an honorable Army officer, this Mike Tobin guy. Tobin told him. The letter was delayed for 2 weeks while Meyer argued over whether the number of victims mentioned in the letter should be 32 or 37. It's a good argument. When Joyce Tobin and Brenda Fox went to his office to discuss the letter, Meyer said he didn't have time to talk. Fox recalls that he was on his way, quote, to make a videotape about the CDC, about it being a model daycare center. He said, despite what you may believe, this is a model daycare center. I sat there thinking, this man has no soul, she says. She told him the numbers were wrong. He said, no, they're not. He waited while they called and found out the numbers were wrong. Under the signatures of Joyce and Mike Tobin, Gretchen and Dennis Runyon, Sue and Tom Dorsey, Michelle and Larry Adams-Thompson, and Brenda and Dom Fox, the letter dated April 29, 1987 was mailed to parents. We feel you should know there are now 37 children identified by the authorities as suspected victims, the letter said in part. We are very concerned that there may be more children affected in need of help that yet remain unidentified. The core group of parents consisted of professional people, doctors, a dentist, a nuclear scientist. They spoke out loud and often. They said they spoke for those who could not, the children and the enlisted people who, they said, were too afraid to risk their military careers to speak out. The enlisted people needed their jobs and the daycare. The core group could afford daycare elsewhere. Quote, when it first started, they had the chance to be heroes, parent Melanie Thompson said about the Army. Instead, they just didn't want to believe it. Now, they're just trying to cover it up like a bad dream. None of the parents who were protesting the Army handling the case knew that signs of trouble had surfaced at the center at least 6 years earlier, and none of them knew that the Army had been dealing with sex abuse problems at its daycare centers for years before the Presidio case broke. The Army said nothing of prior cases at West Point and Fort Dix. The Army said nothing of an investigation 6 years before involving John Gunnarsson, the Presidio's top daycare official and the supervisor of the daycare center during the time Hambright allegedly molested the children. The article then goes on to talk about, in a couple pages, all the incidents of the abuse that happened in that base at the daycare centers. And it's horrible. I suggest you can read it for yourself. But I want to get back to the main topic here, which is Michael Aquino. Later on in the article it says, Larry and Michelle Adams Thompson had noticed changes in their daughter's behavior after placing her in Gary Hambright's class 4 or 5 times in September and October of 1986. The girl, who turned 3 in October, had begun having nightmares and would wet herself, being frightened. Her parents believed it was just a bad stage she was going through until they heard about the Tobin boy in January. The girl was taken to a therapist at Letterman Army Medical Center in February. In therapy, the girl talked about being sexually abused by Hambright and by a man named Mikey and a woman named Shamby, whose identities were unknown. On August 12, 1987, the Adams Thompsons were shopping at the PX at the Presidio. Suddenly, the girl ran to Larry Adams Thompson and clutched his leg. He looked up and saw a man whom he knew as Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. Yes, that's Mikey, the 3-year-old girl told Adams Thompson. After being taken outside, the girl added, he's a bad man, and I'm afraid. As they were leaving the parking lot, the Adams Thompsons saw Aquino's wife, Lilith. Larry asked the child if she knew the woman. Yes, that's Shamby, the girl said. The family went home and called the FBI. When interviewed by authorities the next day, the girl identified Gary Hambright from a photo lineup and said she had been driven to Mikey and Shamby's home by Hambright. There, she said, she was abused by Hambright, Mikey, and Shamby in a room with black walls. She said that she had been photographed. She said Hambright and Mikey were dressed in women's clothes and Shamby was dressed in a man's clothes. Now, to me, this doesn't sound like things that a 3-year-old would make up to me. I don't know. The investigators drove her to Leavenworth Street in San Francisco. The girl was asked to identify any of the houses that she had been to before. While walking past 2430 Leavenworth, The girl identified the house as the one where she met Mikey and Shamby. It was the Aquino's house. A search warrant was served on the Aquino home on August 14th. In attendance were agents from the FBI and the San Francisco police because the abuse allegedly occurred on city property. It was a city case. Among the items seized were videotapes, cassette tapes, notebooks with names and addresses, 2 photo albums, 1 paper plate, and 2 plastic gloves from the kitchen garbage, 4 plastic cases of negatives, and 29 photos of costumes and masks. With his widow's peak and arching eyebrows, Lieutenant Colonel Aquino looks more like a pudgy Dracula than a high-ranking Army officer with a top security clearance. He is the founder and high priest of a Satanic church, the Temple of Set. His wife, Lilith, a gaunt woman with long, dark hair, is a priestess in the temple's Order of the Vampire. The couple refer to the search as, quote, raid, and have branded the investigation as a witch hunt. It's a good thing to brand the investigation as a witch hunt. It's actually what it is.
They kind of look like the Addams family.
Absolutely.
Don't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're very, very much caricature looking.
Yeah.
And I bet they've based lots of
TV
personalities like Mr. Spock and the Addams family on.
Yeah, monsters. I bet they're all. Well, back to the witch hunt. Quote, the Army has known about my religion for the last 18 years, and no problem. Aquino told me in a telephone interview late last year. Quote, not one single person in the US Army, with the exception of the chaplain, would have the remotest notion that I would be involved in anything like this. Well, didn't they find the stuff at his house? Doesn't he use it as the church center?
Yeah.
Are they saying that it was planted there? I don't know. Indeed, Army spokesman at the Pentagon...
They're just all in on it, so they let him get away with it because they participate.
You know that's true.
Yeah, I do know that's true.
Indeed, Army spokesman at the Pentagon label his military career as extraordinary. I think he's extraordinary, all right, and say he's entitled to his religious beliefs. As for his top security clearance, they say his openness about being a Satanist makes him much less of a security risk than a homosexual or someone with a drug or many problems would be.
Money problems.
Yeah. So if you have money problems or a homosexual, you can be blackmailed, but if you're a Satanist and you're a child molesting, murderer, porn maker, and discriminator, because you're open again, you can't be blackmailed about it. Actually, there's some real twisted logic there, but the Army did not suspend his clearance when he joined the Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey in 1969, nor when Aquino founded his own Satanic church in 1975. Nor when Aquino, while on a NATO tour of Europe in 1982, performed a satanic ritual in the Westphalian castle that had been used as an occult sanctuary by Heinrich Himmler, SS elite in Nazi Germany. Nor did the Army move to suspend Aquino's top security clearance during the sexual abuse investigation. Quote, the nature of the investigation that prompted the search of his house, and I understand some of his belongings were taken by police, really is a question for the San Francisco Police Department. This is what Major Greg Rickson, spokesman for the Pentagon, said. Aquino, who now works as a program analyst at the Army Reserve Personnel Center in St. Louis, has vehemently denied ever meeting or having in his house the young girl who has alleged he abused. He unsuccessfully tried to have court-martial proceedings initiated against Adams Thompson. You see, this is what they do. they turn it around. If you accuse someone of being a Satanist, they'll accuse you. That's what Judge Palfrey's doing in the Hampstead case.
Yes, it's very common practice.
Common practice. See, we're getting to see a pattern now. Almost we can tell whether it's a satanic ritual abuse case being covered up because they always do the same thing. Back to the article. In a Temple of Set newsletter sent out 2 months after the search of his home, Aquino accused Adams Thompson, who is an assistant chaplain for the Army, of trumping up allegations as some sort of Christian vendetta. Quote, also relevant is his profession as a Christian clergyman. I certainly doubt that he would have made such an outrageous accusation against any lieutenant colonel who was not known to be a prominent Satanist. Well, I'd have a problem with that because I think, didn't they, the first guy that they took down, the Hambright guy who's involved with this, wasn't he a Christian minister? Mm-hmm. So I think Aquino's full of shit on that one. In April, Aquino wrote a 4-page letter to the head of the Children's Advocates Group in Southern California warning that, quote, we do not intend to see a replay of what happened in Nazi Germany when the reluctance of the Jews to challenge those who systematically and falsely accused Judaism of heinous crimes, including the sexual abuse and ritual murder of Christian children, led to violence against them. Aquino said that the Temple of Set neither prescribes or tolerates any form of harm, sexual or otherwise, to children or animals. Quote, it is made clear in our membership publications that, should we have any reason to think that a member is engaged in any such activity, he or she will be immediately expelled and reported to the appropriate law enforcement or animal protection authorities. Now, wait a minute. This girl not only points at his home, but when they raid his home, these videotapes are found there. I mean, photographs, pornography. Mm-hmm. In a February appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show this year, Aquino said that Satanists, quote, are not servants of some god. We are our own gods. We are our own decision makers, and people naturally fear this, end quote. Their beliefs, he said, are, quote, most closely aligned to that of Plato. Well, let's take this a little bit apart. First of all, if it appears on Oprah Winfrey's show, you should be suspect. She's a paid Kabbalist. I mean, she's part of the deception, and the people that she has, even though they seem incredible, like people like Deepak Chopra. Now, Deepak Chopra is a member of the Club of Rome. So, if she lets Aquino have a voice on her program, and he's lying. They are
high priestess in the Satanist church too, isn't she?
I don't know about that.
I thought I heard that once. I could be wrong.
But he says they're not servants of any god; they're servants of their own gods, and that's a big problem.
Well, that's the first tenet of Satanism.
That's the first tenet of Satanism. Their beliefs are most clearly aligned to that of Plato. Now, I don't know whether you know too much about Plato, but he's revered as being, of course, brilliant and someone who's really created the baseline for Western civilization knowledge and knowledge processes. But I'll tell you one thing. He was an elitist. He taught that there were two types of people. There were the people that rule, and there were the people that follow. And he said that although this is a false dichotomy, like it really doesn't exist like this, we don't tell anybody. So, yeah, closely aligned to Plato. In certain aspects, they might be. Neither Aquino nor his wife have been charged in connection with the case. San Francisco police completed their investigation of the Aquino in June and submitted their findings to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. A decision on whether any charges would be filed was pending when this story went to press, but nothing ever happens. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you, I wanted to create the knowledge with you that we have Satanists on the payroll. We pay them. We pay them to do things that they're good at, like ritual child abuse. What do you think trauma-based mind control consists of? Have you listened to this program before when we've talked about this? The idea in trauma-based mind control, and this is what Tavistock is all about, the Satanists that run Tavistock, and it trickles down to everything. Everything is about mind control now, and basically trauma-based mind control. What they do is they expose people, especially young people, to traumatic situations, like watching somebody be eaten by a snake, or watching someone be murdered, or having to murder someone. These are traumatic things. Even sexual assault at a young age, at maybe any age, is a traumatic effect. And so what happens when they go through that trauma? The trauma is so great that it fragments their personality into several different components, so they become basically schizophrenic. So when faced with different situations, they'll just revert to another personality, and the other personality will take over. And then they program these personalities to serve the masters, to serve, well, in this case, they're serving Satan, which is Michael Aquino, which works for the US government, and that's how they complete the circle. There's the big reason why they hired Michael Aquino and they kept him on even though he's a Satanist is because they knew he was a Satanist and they wanted that kind of help. They wanted Satan on their side. They wanted to win so bad. This is the second tenet of Satanism. If you're all about the physical reality and you're all about the world and you're all about the ego, you win no matter what. You win no matter what kind of morals you have to craft to justify what you're doing. You just win. It's like the philosophy of all major corporations that are publicly traded. You have to do what's in the best interest of your stockholders. And there's no morality other than that. If it's in the best interest of your stockholders, then you do it. You might even be bound by law to do that. You have to act in the best interest, even if it's in the worst interest of mankind. So now, they've taken that on. Now in the Army, we do whatever it takes to achieve our goals, to undertake the hegemony that we need to keep the American population totally under control with mind control slaves in the populace, and other ways to control the populace. They want to do that because winning is all that matters. Controlling is all that matters. And that's what Satan and the satanic cults are all about. They're all about doing whatever it takes, ruthless as hell, communicating with whatever demon species they have to communicate with, to garner their help to fight whoever their enemy is. And let me tell you, I suggest that the enemy is you and me. It's the enemy is people who have a moral standard, who have a backbone, who know the difference between right and wrong, and know how to behave, and haven't given up their whole morality, their whole spiritual, connection with the natural law, the moral law. Nature is spiritual, so it's that whole connection. If you sever that connection, as far as I'm concerned, you're dead. You might as well not even be functioning. I don't care if you're winning. I don't care if you're able to garner the help of some kind of Draco overlord to come and kill people or maim people for you. That's outside of natural law. That doesn't work in this universe. And it's going to stop working for them really soon, I hope.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for
Thank you for sticking
tuning
with us
in.
through the whole thing. I hope it was at least mildly entertaining and informative. Now you know, if evil is on your side, you know who your enemy is.
That's right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on The World